You know, when you picture the ultimate literary genius, it is almost always the exact same image.
Oh, yeah, the solitary figure.
Right, exactly. Like, we imagine this guy sitting at a rustic wooden desk. There is a ruffled collar, a quill pen scratching across parchment by candlelight, and the man is just staring off into the middle distance, completely lost in some kind of, divine poetic reverie.
Yeah, it's an incredibly pervasive cultural image. I mean, it positions the artist as this lofty philosopher residing on a mountaintop, right?
Yeah.
Completely insulated from the gritty transactional nature of the real world.
And it's a comforting fiction. We desperately want to believe that our greatest art is produced in a vacuum of pure inspiration.
Right.
But then you step into the actual historical archives and you look at the empirical data,
Yeah.
and that pristine, romanticized image just shatters into a million pieces. Because, I mean, what if I told you that the greatest writer in the English language was actually an aggressive real estate investor?
It's a very aggressive one.
Yeah. A man who, during a devastating regional famine, actively hoarded massive quantities of grain, like specifically to artificially drive up prices while his own neighbors were starving in the streets.
It's wild. That historical whiplash is exactly what makes the true story so much more compelling than the myth. I mean, you are looking at a man operating in a fiercely competitive, often brutal, economic reality.
And that contradiction is the core of our deep dive today. I've been just poring over this monumental scholarly compilation, the Oxford Handbook of Shakespeare, and it completely rewrites how we understand this cultural icon.
It really does. It breaks everything down.
We are stripping away the centuries of sacred mythology here to find the actual sweating, pragmatic, and sometimes ruthless working playwright underneath. And we're going to systematically explore this handbook. We'll look at the text, the conditions of his society, his works, the performances, and even some wild speculations.
Right, because to understand the poetry, you really have to understand the gritty reality of the man's life first.
Yeah.
You have to understand the brutal world of 16th century Stratford.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the staggering statistics, the raw data that Arthur F. Kinney and the other scholars present, it's just, I mean, I was geeking out over the sheer volume of output.
The raw metrics alone defy modern comprehension of productivity. Like, when scholars aggregate the surviving texts from the entire era of early modern English theater, we are looking at roughly 230 extant plays.
Okay.
And William Shakespeare is involved either as the sole author or as a documented collaborator in over 15% of that entire surviving canon.
15% of an entire era's artistic output tied to one guy. That is insane. And when you break down his specific contributions, the numbers get even wilder.
Oh, absolutely.
We are talking about 884,647 words, which translates to over 51,000 individual speeches spread across, 118,000 lines of text.
And we really have to consider that this isn't just a volume of standard vocabulary, The linguistic processing power required to generate that output is extraordinary because he was actively engineering the language as he went.
Right.
I mean, the Oxford English Dictionary currently credits Shakespeare with the first recorded use of 2,035 distinct words.
Over 2,000 words that he just manifested into existence because he needed them.
Yeah, exactly. But the crucial context here is why he needed them. These were not obscure, highly academic terms meant to show off his education.
No.
He was building structural, load-bearing vocabulary that we still use daily. The research highlights words like frugal, dwindle, assassination, barefooted, and abstentious.
I want to linger on that for a second, specifically the word assassination. Because he didn't just invent a cool-sounding arrangement of syllables, right? He had to invent a word because the society lacked the specific terminology to conceptualize the exact type of political, treacherous murder he was trying to stage. He was basically beta testing entirely new cognitive concepts live on stage.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. He was giving his audience the linguistic tools to process complex political and emotional realities. But to understand where that relentless drive and capacity for invention comes from, the research demands we ground ourselves in the intense, often traumatizing reality of his early biography.
Yeah, this was not a soft life.
Not at all. I mean, born in 1564, and just a few months later, the plague hits.
Yeah, the Parish Register in Stratford essentially reads, here begins the plague.
The epidemic that swept through Stratford that autumn was catastrophic.
Oh.
The town lost roughly 1 in 7 of its residents. Over 200 people died in a very short window of time. And the psychological weight of that environment is profound. Simply surviving your first year of life was a statistical anomaly. Death wasn't an abstract philosophical concept to be mused over. It was a highly visible, physical reality dictating the terms of everyday existence.
And navigating that chaotic existence requires a certain kind of personality, which, brings us to his family dynamic. Like father, like son. Specifically his father, John Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Because the romantic myth usually paints the family as quaint rural craftsmen, right?
Right.
But John Shakespeare was, for lack of a better term, a massive hustler.
He really was. He was a man who understood how to play the system, or at least how to find the lucrative angles within it. I mean, John started as a glover, working with leather, but he quickly maneuvered himself into the civic hierarchy.
Right.
He became the borough ale taster. Which sounds trivial to modern ears, but in a society where water was often unsafe and ale was a dietary staple, controlling the measures and prices of beer was a position of serious local power.
And from there, he just climbs the ladder. He becomes a constable, an alderman, and eventually the high bailiff, which is essentially the equivalent of the town mayor.
Exactly, the pinnacle of civic respectability.
But the historical records the scholars highlight show that underneath that mayor's chain, John Shakespeare was running a highly illegal shadow economy.
The documentation there is fascinating. In 1569, while holding civic office, he was prosecuted for usury.
Meaning he was charging illegal, exorbitant interest rates on loans to his own neighbors?
Yes. And he was also caught engaging in illegal wool dealing, operating on the black market to bypass royal monopolies and taxes. He was constantly riding the very thin, blurry line between legitimate community leader and aggressive black market operator.
And it eventually catches up to him. I mean, he falls from grace entirely. He's forced to mortgage his wife's inheritance. He has to sell off his land. And the records show he even stopped attending church.
Right, which scholars believe was out of fear of being served with debt papers in public. He was stripped of his alderman position.
Think about the developmental impact that trajectory has on a young William Shakespeare. He watches his father aggressively claw his way to the absolute top of the local social and economic ladder, only to suffer a humiliating, highly public financial ruin due to over-leverage and illegal speculation.
Which perfectly explains the incident in 1597,
Yeah.
the grain hoarding.
Yes, let's talk about that, because William is now a wildly successful playwright down in London, making serious money. But he's funneling that cash back into Stratford real estate.
Right.
Now, 1597 is a year of terrible dearth. Crops have failed across the region, starvation is a literal threat, and the price of basic bread shoots up 400%.
And in response to the crisis, the town bailiff conducts an emergency inventory of the entire town, to ensure the remaining grain is distributed fairly to prevent mass starvation.
Yeah.
And during this audit, they catch William Shakespeare hoarding a massive illegal stockpile of grain.
He is deliberately sitting on the supply during a famine to corner the market. I mean, that is brutal. And the kicker is, while he is price gouging his starving neighbors in Stratford, the records show he is simultaneously defaulting on his London taxes.
It's incredible.
He's literally dodging the tax man in the city while acting as a ruthless disaster capitalist in the country. Instead of comparing him to a lofty philosopher on a mountaintop, isn't it more accurate to view him as an aggressive, modern tech startup founder or a ruthless Wall Street trader?
The parallels to modern corporate behavior are absolutely striking. You have an individual who is hyper-attuned to the mechanics of supply and demand, who understands market fluctuations, and who is entirely unsentimental about capitalizing on an unfair advantage.
But wait, let me push back here. Let me play devil's advocate. How does that ruthless, almost sociopathic capitalist drive square with the guy who wrote Romeo and Juliet? Do we actually see the grain-hoarding tax dodger in the poetry? Or are his business life and his artistic life completely siloed?
Well, the research suggests they are intimately connected, provided you know how to read the plays.
Yeah.
That lived experience fundamentally shapes his understanding of human motivation.
Okay, give me an example.
Look at a play like The Merchant of Venice. It revolves entirely around the lethal mechanics of a bond. Or Timon of Athens, which is a grueling exploration of debt, credit, and the psychological destruction of financial ruin.
Oh, wow.
That isn't theoretical philosophy. That is the lived experience of a man whose family was destroyed by debt and who himself routinely sued his own neighbors over minor financial disputes. He understood on a molecular level that human relationships are incredibly transactional.
That completely strips away the romanticism. His business acumen wasn't just a side hustle, it was the primary lens through which he viewed the world. And that intense business acumen didn't stop at grain and real estate. It was the driving force behind his actual profession, right? The incredibly cutthroat London theater scene.
Precisely. The scholarship urges us to view early modern playing companies not as whimsical troupes of artists, but as highly structured, aggressive commercial enterprises. The hierarchy of these companies was entirely financial.
So break down the mechanics of these playing companies for us.
Okay, so at the top you had the sharers, a small group of men, including Shakespeare, who owned a financial stake in the company. They took on the risk and split the profits. Below them were the hired men.
The wage workers.
Exactly, paid a daily wage to act in minor roles or take tickets. And at the bottom were the boy apprentices, bound by contract to the sharers, who played all the female roles.
And the sheer volume of product this corporate structure had to churn out is just mind-boggling. I mean, we think of a modern Broadway show where actors rehearse one play for months and perform it for a year. The research notes these Elizabethan companies kept up to 30 different plays in active repertoire at any given time.
The cognitive load placed on the actors is difficult to overstate. An actor in Shakespeare's company might be required to memorize, retain, and recall up to 15,000 lines of blank verse simultaneously.
Wait, 15,000 lines? That is the length of a novel, just memorized, ready to be performed at a moment's notice.
And the production schedule was relentless. To maintain their profit margins, they had to constantly feed the public's demand for novelty.
Right.
This meant the company was typically rehearsing a brand new play in the morning and then performing a completely different established play from their repertoire in the afternoon, 6 days a week.
Yeah.
It was a massive, high-pressure content mill.
Which sets the stage for what has to be the most incredible anecdote in this entire body of research, the Great Globe Heist. December 28, 1598. I was so excited to talk about this.
It is a remarkable convergence of legal loophole, theatrical pragmatism, and sheer audacity.
Let's set the scene for the listener. So Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, are performing in a venue in Shoreditch, literally just called the Theater, but they have a massive problem. The ground lease on the land has expired.
Yes.
And the landlord is a notoriously difficult man who is threatening to take possession of the physical building itself, effectively seizing the company's primary means of production.
And without a venue, the company's financial model completely collapses. They are facing imminent ruin.
So what do these highly educated poets do? Under the cover of darkness, on a freezing winter night just after Christmas, the acting company hires a crew of workmen. They show up to the property and systematically dismantle the entire massive oak-timbered theater.
Overnight.
They pull out the wooden pegs, take apart the heavy framing, and physically haul the massive timbers across the frozen River Thames into the neighboring jurisdiction of Southwark. They essentially steal their own building and use the stolen wood to construct a brand new venue, the legendary Globe Theater.
It is the ultimate act of corporate piracy, but it perfectly illustrates the central thesis of the Handbook's approach to the theater business. These men were intensely pragmatic and fiercely protective of their capital assets. They did not have the luxury of sitting around waiting for inspiration. They had to aggressively secure their market position.
And this fast-paced, high-stakes commercial reality leads to the debunking of the second massive myth, the idea of the solitary, isolated genius. If you are running a content mill that demands constant new material to stay solvent, you don't have time to sit alone in a room waiting for the muse to strike.
The research on this is definitive. The chapters by scholars Hugh Craig and McDonald P. Jackson utilize incredibly sophisticated computer testing and stylometric analysis to prove that collaboration was the absolute industry standard. Shakespeare was not a solo act. He was part of a dynamic, highly collaborative writer's room.
I want to dig into that term stylometric analysis. How exactly are computers reading Shakespeare and proving he didn't write something? What are they actually measuring here?
It relies on the concept of a linguistic fingerprint. When human beings write, we naturally focus on the big, meaning-laden words, the nouns, the verbs, the adjectives. But we have very little conscious control over our use of function words.
Function words.
Yeah, these are the tiny, invisible structural words, but the width, too.
The mortar between the bricks.
Exactly. Every single writer uses those function words at a unique, mathematically consistent frequency. By feeding thousands of text into an algorithm, computational linguistics can establish a baseline frequency for Shakespeare's subconscious habits,
Okay.
and then compare it to the baseline of his contemporaries. The algorithm tracks these invisible micropatterns with incredible precision. And what the data clearly shows is sudden, jarring shifts in the linguistic fingerprint within a single play.
Meaning someone else took over the pen for that specific scene?
Yes. The data allows scholars to confidently list his proven partnerships. And it reads like a who's who of the early modern commercial theater. We have George Peele clearly co-writing First Henry VI and Titus Andronicus, Thomas Middleton stepping in to collaborate on Timon of Athens,
Right.
George Wilkins, who historical records suggest was also running a local brothel, by the way, co-writing Pericles. And toward the end of his career, as he was preparing to retire, John Fletcher was brought in to co-write Henry VIII and Two Noble Kinsmen.
But the research points out that this wasn't just Shakespeare lazily outsourcing a few scenes because he was tired, right? He was actively learning his craft from these co-authors. The collaboration produced art that neither man could have created alone.
What's fascinating here is how the handbook highlights a brilliant example of this dialectic in Titus Andronicus. His collaborator, George Peele, was famous for a very harsh, unyielding, almost shockingly brutal rhetorical style.
Okay.
So Peele writes the opening act, where the protagonist Titus is presented as a cold-blooded Roman general, perfectly willing to brutally sacrifice his own son for a matter of honor.
He establishes this terrifyingly rigid world.
But then, the stylometric analysis shows Shakespeare taking over the later scenes. And what Shakespeare does is actively push against Peele's harshness. He injects scenes of intense parental protection and profound grief.
Oh, wow.
He counters the cruelty of Peele's setup with moments of deep, messy human empathy. The collaboration creates a tension within the DNA of the play itself, making it infinitely more complex.
It really is like a modern television writer's room. They are passing scripts back and forth, punching up dialogue, fixing structural issues, playing off each other's strengths.
Exactly.
But this raises a massive logistical question for me. If these plays were born from this messy, collaborative, fast-paced commercial environment, literally written in pieces for actors to memorize on the fly, how on earth did they eventually become the pristine, sacred, bound books we study in school today?
The transition of these texts from the messy stage to the printed page is one of the most critical shifts the handbook explores. To understand it, we have to look at the physical formats of the books themselves. During Shakespeare's actual lifetime, roughly half of his plays were printed in a format known as quartos.
Which were essentially the cheap, flimsy, mass-market paperbacks of their day.
Very cheap, very disposable. They were small single-play editions, often rushed to the printing press to capitalize on the momentary popularity of a production. But the source material for these quartos varied wildly. Sometimes the printer got a hold of Shakespeare's rough working drafts, which scholars call foul paper.
Foul papers.
Yeah, full of crossed-out lines and confusing stage directions.
And sometimes they didn't even have a script at all, right?
Right. If a printer wanted to steal the text, they would hire actors who had performed in the play to recite what they could remember from memory. These reconstructed texts are known as bad quartos. They are full of errors, paraphrasing, and missing scenes.
Which means if you bought a quarto of Hamlet in 1603, it might read completely differently than the play you saw on stage the week before.
Exactly.
The texts were incredibly unstable. It reminds me of modern video games that launch full of bugs, and then the developers just keep dropping patches to fix the code. The early modern text was a live, fluid thing.
It wasn't until 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, that his former acting colleagues managed to compile the first folio. The folio was a massive, expensive, highly prestigious physical format. It was a format historically reserved for serious theology, classical philosophy, or royal histories.
Right.
By publishing the collected plays of a commercial playwright in a folio format, his friends were making a massive cultural argument. They were declaring that these plays were not just disposable entertainment, they were literature worthy of preservation.
And the way modern scholars study these physical books has completely shifted, hasn't it? The handbook mentions a movement originally coined by David Scott Castan called the New Boredom.
It is a wonderfully ironic title for what is actually a highly enthusiastic scholarly movement.
I love that name.
For centuries, editors tried to strip away all the historical variations and errors to find the one, pure, perfect text that Shakespeare supposedly intended to write. The New Boredom rejects that.
Okay.
Instead, scholars enthusiastically embrace the hyper-detailed historical particularity of book history. the messy reality of the printing house, and textural materiality. They study the specific watermarks on the paper to trace trade routes. They analyze the specific spelling habits of the individual workmen who set the type to see where mistakes were made.
They study the smudges of ink.
Yes, they view the physical book not as a container for genius, but as a collaborative artifact produced by dozens of working-class hands.
Which brings us to the hands of the actual people who bought those books, the early writers. Because the chapter by Sonia Masai fundamentally changed how I view literature.
It's a great chapter.
Today, you or I might pick up a novel simply to be entertained. We want a good read. We read passively, allowing the narrative to wash over us and transport us.
But the research is clear that early modern readers approached texts with a completely different mindset. They read with extreme, almost aggressive utility. Reading wasn't passive. It was an act of extraction.
Yes, the art of commonplacing. I was fascinated by this. How did this actual physical process work?
Well, the early modern education system was heavily focused on the art of rhetoric, the ability to persuade and speak eloquently. So when an individual read a printed book, they read with a pen in hand, hunting for usable material.
Like what kind of material?
They were looking for brilliant metaphors, moral lessons, or what they called sententiae, short, highly condensed philosophical statements. When they found a phrase they liked, they would physically copy it out of the printed book and write it into their own personal handwritten notebook, known as a commonplace book.
And they would organize these notebooks by highly specific topics, right? You'd have a page for quotes about love, a page for death, a page for political betrayal.
Exactly. It was a personalized database of rhetoric. When they needed to write a letter or make a speech, they would consult their commonplace book for the perfect extracted quote.
It is uncanny how similar this is to modern digital behavior. Isn't commonplacing exactly what we do when we save quotes to a Pinterest board?
Yes, absolutely.
Or when you are reading a nonfiction book on your Kindle and you aggressively highlight a specific sentence just so you can pull it out and drop a really smart-sounding quote in a business meeting the next day. It is the exact same human impulse. We are constantly curating fragments of text to enhance our own social or professional standing.
The parallel is flawless. We are still a culture of commonplacers. And understanding this completely reframes the mechanics of Shakespeare's writing process.
How so?
He wasn't just writing naturalistic dialogue for his characters. He was purposely seeding his plays with highly extractable, incredibly quotable maxims. He knew his audience was sitting out there, either literally with a notebook or mentally, waiting to extract value from his words.
Wait, really? So he was consciously writing for the 16th century, quote, board?
Without a doubt. Consider the famous scene in Hamlet where Polonius gives a long, rambling list of advice to his son Laertes before he leaves for France.
Neither a borrower nor a lender be.
Exactly. To thine own self be true. Give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. Modern audiences often view that speech as just a father being long-winded. But to an early modern reader, that entire speech is essentially a prepackaged gold mine list of commonplace quotes ready to be extracted. Shakespeare is actively playing to the specific reading habits of his commercial audience.
That is wild to think about. It means these texts weren't just read in an intellectual vacuum. They were actively disassembled, chopped up into pieces, and used by regular people trying to navigate the complexities of their own lives.
Yeah.
And they were doing this in a society that was undergoing massive tectonic structural shifts, which is a perfect transition because these texts weren't just read in a vacuum, right? They were actively used by readers trying to navigate a society that was undergoing massive structural shifts.
Which is why the handbook transitions from the text itself to the broader societal conditions of Shakespeare's world. To understand how the plays functioned, we have to understand the rigid systems governing the people watching them. Systems like status, law, and gender.
And status in Elizabethan England wasn't just about who had the most money, it was a legally enforced reality.
The hierarchy was incredibly rigid. Society was governed by sumptuary laws, which legally dictated exactly what fabrics you were allowed to wear, what colors you could display, and how you were to be addressed, all based entirely on your birth class.
Unbelievable.
But the scholarship notes that Shakespeare, a commoner who bought his way into gentility, was constantly prodding at the artificial boundaries of this system.
Where do we see him poking holes in the concept of status?
It is a recurring obsession across his entire career. Look at an early history play like 2 Henry VI. He stages Jack Cade's Rebellion, which is a terrifying, chaotic, but deeply fascinating look at the absolute bottom of the social ladder, attempting to violently dismantle the aristocracy. In The Merchant of Venice, he gives us Shylock, an ethnic and religious outsider who brilliantly weaponizes the mechanics of wealth and the city's own laws to temporarily achieve total dominance over the Christian elite.
He flips the power dynamic using the sisters' own rules.
Yes. In King Lear, you have an absolute monarch who literally strips off his royal garments in a raging storm to understand the reality of what he calls the unaccommodated man, the lowest, most destitute, naked beggar.
Wow.
And perhaps most famously, in The Tempest, the rigid hierarchy of European nobility is completely obliterated the moment their ship hits a violent storm. The lowly boatswain famously screams at the royalty to get below deck and get out of his way, saying, "What cares these roarers for the name of king?"
The roaring waves do not care about your sumptuary laws. Nature does not recognize a king.
Exactly. Through the safety of theatrical fiction, he is constantly demonstrating to his audience that societal status is an artificial construct. It is a performance that can be stripped away in an instant, rather than a divine, immutable right.
And speaking of artificial constructs that govern human behavior, the deep dive into the legal system is mind-bending. Rebecca Lemon's chapter in the Handbook details how Shakespeare was writing during a period of massive, confusing legal revolution in England.
The shift in how English society defined truth and justice during this era cannot be overstated. For centuries, the culture operated on medieval concepts of justice, like trial by combat or trial by ordeal.
Right.
In those systems, you essentially believed that God would actively intervene in the physical world to reveal the truth and protect the innocent.
Which is a system that obviously doesn't hold up to any kind of modern, rational scrutiny.
No, and it was actively being dismantled during Shakespeare's lifetime. It was being replaced by the rapid expansion of the common law, and crucially, the rise of the jury system. But shifting to a jury system requires a completely new cognitive framework for an entire society. It introduces the incredibly tricky concept of probability. It suddenly requires 12 ordinary citizens to listen to conflicting narratives, evaluate physical evidence, and weigh the likelihood of human intention. It birthed what scholars call a culture of fact.
And the profound insight here is that the theater isn't just a place to escape this confusing new legal reality. The theater is actually a training simulator for it. Early modern audiences were grappling with these confusing legal changes in real time.
Precisely. The architecture of a play is essentially the architecture of a trial. You have characters stepping forward to present highly persuasive, totally conflicting narratives. You have physical evidence being presented to the audience, sometimes true and sometimes deliberately falsified, like the infamous planted handkerchief in Othello.
So the audience watching Othello is basically sitting in the jury box.
They are. The playwright is asking the audience to actively evaluate intention, weigh the probability of the character's claims, and sit in judgment. The research suggests that Shakespeare's plays actually helped early modern audiences grapple with the mechanics of the common law. They were going to the theater to practice the critical thinking skills required to be modern citizens in a culture of fact.
That is brilliant. The theater as a simulator for jury duty. And the plays were interrogating another massive societal construct, too, the nature of gender itself. The chapter by Andrew Hiscock really forces us to unlearn our modern biological assumptions.
It really does.
Because the Elizabethan debate wasn't just about what social roles women were permitted to play. It was about how the society fundamentally understood the anatomical biology of human difference.
We have to remember that the early modern understanding of human anatomy relied heavily on classical models, particularly the medical texts of the ancient Greek physician Galen. The dominant medical theory was the one-sex model.
The one-sex model.
Yeah, they often viewed the female body not as a distinctly separate biological system, but as an inverted, colder, less perfect version of the male body. In this paradigm, gender difference was seen as terrifyingly fluid and unstable.
Which casts the reality of the Elizabethan stage in a completely different light.
Yeah.
Legally, women were strictly forbidden from performing on the public commercial stage. So every single iconic female role he wrote, Juliet, Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth, was written for and performed by a young male apprentice.
And modern audiences often view that as just a quirky historical limitation. But the scholarship argues it was much more profound. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the practice of boy actors cross-dressing on a daily basis was a highly charged, highly visible way for the society to rhetorically examine and stress-test normative gender identities.
Because Shakespeare leans into it. He doesn't try to hide the boy actors. He writes plays where the boy actor is playing a woman who then disguises herself as a young boy.
Right.
You see this with Rosalind in As You Like It or Viola in Twelfth Night. You are layering gender performance on top of gender performance.
By foregrounding that theatricality, he exposes gender not as an immutable biological fact, but as a cultural construction. He shows that gender is a set of learned behaviors, specific clothing choices, and rhetorical styles.
Wow.
By putting that fluid performance center stage, the plays actively question the heavy societal pressures used to enforce the boundaries between men and women. He's demonstrating how easily those boundaries can be manipulated.
It is incredibly subversive. Shakespeare was deeply invested in exposing the invisible systems, the laws, the class structures, the gender norms that govern human society. But what makes this deep dive so expansive is that his curiosity extended far beyond human society into the realms of the natural world and cutting-edge science. Which brings us to the section the scholars call speculations. Science, technology, and pragmatism.
And this is where we see the playwright as an intensely observant sponge, absorbing the technological revolution happening around him. Adam Max Cohen's research on science and technology completely reframes our understanding of his imagery.
I am obsessed with this specific chapter because traditionally we think of Shakespeare purely as a poet of the pastoral, right? He writes about birds and blooming flowers and the gentle moonlight, but Cohen argues that Shakespeare was actually the ultimate mechanical playwright.
He really was.
He is obsessed with the mechanics of how things actually work. Where is a poet learning about complex machinery?
Well, we return to the material reality of his early life. He didn't grow up in an isolated library. He grew up in a busy workshop. He likely learned how to handle tools, observe mechanical processes, and understand leverage and tension in his father's glove-making shop.
Ah, right.
Leatherworking is an industrial process involving specific chemicals, stretching frames, and cutting tools. Furthermore, at the King's New School in Stratford, the curriculum wouldn't just have been poetry. He would have been exposed to classical texts, detailing the ancient marvels of engineering, hydraulics, and architecture.
And he takes all that practical mechanical knowledge and turns it into theatrical metaphors.
He utilizes a staggering wealth of mechanical imagery. He doesn't just compare the human heart to a flower. He uses the intricate gears of clocks to describe the internal hidden workings of human emotion and the destructive mechanical march of time.
Right.
He uses the cutting-edge technology of detailed maps and magnetic compasses to describe the topography of the human face or the complex navigation of political statecraft. He is looking at the human body, the state, and the cosmos itself through the very specific lens of early modern technology.
The research draws a direct parallel between Shakespeare's mindset and the great scientific philosopher of his era, Francis Bacon.
Yes, Francis Bacon was championing the empirical method, the revolutionary idea that knowledge doesn't come from ancient authority, but from rigorous physical observation and experimentation. The Handbook argues that Shakespeare is doing the exact same thing, but his laboratory is the theater.
I love that.
He's experimenting with human psychology. He sets up complex variables in his plots, introduces a catalyst, and rigorously observes the reactions of his characters.
And the scope of that laboratory just kept expanding. Jane Hoying Degenhardt's work focuses on how England's growing awareness of the wider globe manifested on the wooden stage. During his lifetime, the English were rapidly transforming into a maritime power, engaging in vast cross-cultural commerce and exploration.
And Shakespeare perfectly captures both the intense excitement and the deep anxiety of that global expansion. The Handbook focuses heavily on his repeated use of the Mediterranean.
Okay.
To the early modern English audience, the Mediterranean wasn't just a sunny vacation destination. It was a highly volatile, dangerous, multicultural frontier of East-West commerce. It was the absolute edge of their known world, where Christian Europe violently collided with the Islamic Ottoman Empire.
Right. We see this in settings like Venice or the military outpost of Cyprus and Othello.
Exactly. What is remarkable is how he translates these vast, terrifying geographical distances and incredibly complex geopolitical conflicts onto the tiny, confined physical stage of the Globe Theater. He is allowing a local insular London audience to safely process the massive implications of global trade, the shock of cross-cultural encounters, and the anxiety of religious difference.
Which requires an incredibly flexible, almost terrifyingly observant mind. And that intellectual flexibility is perfectly captured by Lars Engels' concept of pragmatism, which is the next major speculation explored in the Handbook.
Pragmatism, in this scholarly context, is a very specific philosophical stance. It is the belief that pure, objective, absolute truth is generally inaccessible to human beings.
Right.
Instead, pragmatism argues that truth is simply what works in a specific lived context. It focuses entirely on the painful tension between massive, rigid, abstract systems like religious doctrine or political ideology and the incredibly messy, contradictory day-to-day reality of human experience.
Okay, wait, hold on. I have to push back here. Wait, how does a playwright who never seemingly left England and whose main priority was making money manage to accurately capture the philosophical shift toward pragmatism and the nuances of global exploration? Is he actually a deep philosopher, or is he just a really, really good mimic of what he hears in the taverns?
That question is the central tension of Shakespearean genius. The answer the handbook provides is that he didn't need to be a formal academic philosopher,
Hmm.
because the mechanics of the theater itself are inherently pragmatic. A successful play requires dramatic conflict, and conflict arises precisely when rigid abstract ideals crash into messy reality.
Give me an example of that crash.
Take Hamlet. The abstract ideal governing the play is the ancient revenge code. A son must unequivocally avenge his murdered father. That is the system.
Yeah.
But the messy human reality is Hamlet's actual conscience, his crippling uncertainty, his modern fear of religious damnation. A lesser playwright would give us a neat philosophical answer. Shakespeare doesn't. He just gives us the agonizing tension of a human being caught between the two. He was the ultimate sponge, absorbing the legal debates, the scientific advancements, and the global anxieties of his culture, and reflecting them back in a way that felt undeniably true to lived experience.
And it is precisely this incredible capacity to absorb and reflect the world that allowed his work to eventually conquer it. Which brings us to the final massive shift in our deep dive: global afterlives and modern marketing. We are leaving 16th century Stratford and the Globe Theatre far behind.
We are moving into Tun Hohenslar's comprehensive research on Shakespeare and the world. This section forces us to look at the sheer, overwhelming scale of his global phenomenon, and a massive part of understanding that global spread is a concept scholars call intersemiotic transfer.
Intersemiotic transfer, which is a very heavy, dense academic phrase. What does that actually mean in practice?
The concept is actually quite beautiful. It means taking the core meaning and emotional weight of Shakespeare's English words and translating them into entirely new sign systems that don't rely on the English language at all. We are talking about translating the plays into pure physical gesture in ballet, into visual images in painting, and most notably, into sound.
And the data point in the handbook that absolutely floored me is about the translation into sound, the operatic bard. The research notes there are between 300 and 400 distinct operas based directly on Shakespearean materials.
It is a staggering number. You have master composers like Verdi taking complex psychological plays like Othello and Macbeth and realizing something profound. The emotional core of those stories doesn't actually need the English verse to survive.
Really?
Yeah, the suffocating jealousy of Othello, the ruthless ambition of Macbeth, the profound grief, those massive human emotions, can be perfectly carried and amplified by the architecture of orchestral music.
He has literally transcended his own language. But his global afterlife isn't just about beautiful music and ballet. The handbook also dives deep into the incredibly complex, often dark politics of his global spread.
Yes. The handbook extensively examines the post-colonial aspect of Shakespeare's legacy. It is a historical fact that during the height of the British Empire, Shakespeare was aggressively exported as a tool of cultural dominance.
Right. And just to be clear to the listener, we are neutrally reporting the scholarly consensus presented in the handbook here without taking a political stance ourselves.
Exactly. Historically, his work was mandated in colonial schools across the globe as the absolute pinnacle of civilized literature, which was often used as a justification for the detriment, marginalization, or outright suppression of local indigenous cultures and storytelling traditions.
The plays were essentially weaponized as proof of cultural superiority.
They were. However, what the modern scholarship focuses on is the powerful phenomenon of writing back. Nations and cultures that previously faced political and cultural suppression under the empire are now actively appropriating the Shakespearean text.
Writing back.
Yes. They are taking his plots, his characters, and his cultural weight, and they are using them to tell their own stories, to aggressively critique colonialism, and to produce entirely new original artistic genres. They are reclaiming the global icon and making it serve their own political and artistic needs.
It is fascinating. He acts as this universal cultural mirror that every nation can hold up to its own history. But alongside that profound political utility, there is also a deeply cynical, or at least highly commercial, side to his immortality.
Oh, absolutely.
Douglas M. Lanier's research on marketing looks at the cold, hard economics of the modern Shakespeare industry.
And Lanier argues that the marketing of Shakespeare has always been driven by the economic supply side of culture. The industry of selling Shakespeare began almost immediately. Early modern publishers quickly realized that simply printing his name on the title page of a flimsy quarto sold more copies.
Right.
This evolved into the massive, commercialized 18th century Stratford Jubilees that sold relics supposedly made from his mulberry tree.
And it continues right into the modern era of Hollywood film and television adaptations. I mean, the Kenneth Branagh epics, the hyperkinetic Baz Luhrmann Romeo plus Juliet in the 90s, the teen comedies like 10 Things I Hate About You, which is just the taming of the shrew repackaged for high schoolers.
Precisely. Shakespeare is no longer just a playwright. He is a commodity. He is a globally recognized brand that instantly signals quality, prestige, and high drama. Entire industries exist continually finding new ways to package, adapt, and sell that underlying brand to entirely new demographics to generate revenue.
So what does this all mean? When you step back and look at the entire scope of the research we've covered today, the irony is almost too perfect. The grain-hoarding businessman from Stratford has become the ultimate global commodity.
He would have absolutely loved the merchandising rights.
He would be furious he wasn't getting a percentage of the global box office and the t-shirt sales.
Without a doubt, he understood the value of his intellectual property better than anyone.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, completely deconstructing the myth of the solitary genius. We started in the gritty, plague-ridden realities of 16th century Stratford. We looked at a young man born to a disgraced, hustling father, learning the harsh realities of debt and civic survival.
We really did.
We examined the nocturnal theft of the Globe Theater, the relentless, exhausting pace of the collaborative early modern writer's room, and the computational stylometric science that proves beyond a doubt he did not work alone.
We tracked his intense, pragmatic engagement with a society in total flux. We saw how the plays acted as a simulator for the legal shift from divine ordeal to a modern culture fact. We explored the visual subversion of rigid gender norms on the stage, the infusion of cutting-edge mechanical and scientific metaphors, and the pragmatic philosophy that grounded his soaring poetry in the messy reality of human life.
And finally, we followed his extraordinary transformation from a working English playwright scrambling to secure a theater lease into a global multimedia brand, adapted into hundreds of operas and utilized by post-colonial nations to write back to the empire.
And the reason this deeply granular, highly material deep dive matters, the reason this handbook is so vital, is that stripping away the romantic mythology actually makes his work infinitely more accessible.
Yeah.
When we stop viewing him as a solitary god on a mountaintop handing down divine truth, we find a working, sweating, incredibly pragmatic human being. He wasn't a god. He was responding to a world that was in rapid, terrifying flux. Plagues, economic crashes, legal revolutions, global expansion, and technological shifts.
Which sounds exactly like the chaotic world we are all trying to navigate right now.
Precisely. His insights into human character, the corrupting nature of power, the flaws in the law, and the performance of society aren't timeless because they were handed down from heaven.
Yeah.
They were timeless because he was hyper-engaged with the basic mechanics of human survival in a chaotic world. And that makes his writing completely relevant and highly useful to the rapid changes we face today.
I love that. He is useful. And to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought, I want to build on that concept of commonplacing we discussed earlier. The way those early modern readers would aggressively extract fragments of text, copying quotes into personal notebooks to curate their own identities and rhetorical arsenals.
It is a fascinating historical practice that reveals so much about how they constructed their sense of self.
So think about the digital fragments you interact with and save every single day. The quotes you retweet, the articles you bookmark, the memes you share on your phone, the videos you favorite, the snippets you drop in group chats. You are actively, constantly creating your own massive, modern, commonplace book.
Oh, for sure.
If scholars 400 years from now were to dig up your digital footprint and analyze your curated fragments, what would they deduce about the conditions and speculations of your life? What story are your saved fragments telling the future about you?
That is a slightly terrifying but brilliant thought to end on.
We want to warmly thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. It has been a wild ride through the gritty, pragmatic, and real history of Shakespeare. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the comforting myths, and always seek out multiple perspectives.
Until next time.